Start with a talk by Alessandro Acquisti, who will talk about the economics of privacy, one of the earliest authors to work on the economics of privacy. And then, without a break, we'll have talk by Katrina Leggett on the buying private data without verification. So, Alessandro will have time till 2:30, and that's together with the questions and everything.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, so I'm glad to be able to connect. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. This is my intense teaching season here at CMU, so I have to be physically in Pittsburgh. However, I look forward to both presenting this review of the economics of privacy and getting some of your questions. And I'm going to start sharing the slides. Can you let me know whether you see now on your screen my slides rather than my face?
Yes.
Well, so what I'm going to do is the following: is to provide a overview of this field of research, the economics of privacy. So my presentation will focus more on past work rather than presenting a new study. Although here and there I will indeed make references to some recent studies. So the idea is to provide a primer for non-economists to this field, which actually the field didn't start with internet, started already in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and has quite a high pedigree in that some of the early contributors to this field were very well-known economists such as Chicago School, law and econ scholars like Stigler and Posner. I will focus, I will base my talk on a review that we just published a few months ago, just this June, in JELF, the Journal of Economic Literature, which for economists is the premier outlet for reviews of fields of economics. This was a work I completed with Curtis Taylor, who is at Duke, Department of Economics, and Liad Wagman, who is at Northwestern. It took us quite a while to finish. A combination of procrastination and the field kept expanding. So in a way, behavior economists sometimes talk about optimal procrastination. Maybe this was the optimal procrastination that as we finished this literature review in 2011 or 2012, we would have missed some of the very interesting things which happened in this field in the last 3 years. The structure of the talk will be the following. I'll start with a brief history. As I was mentioning, the field is not recent. It predates significantly internet and some of the more pressing issues that we face currently in the policy debate over data privacy. I will discuss some of what I consider the most interesting open issues currently, and I will finish with some potential conclusions. What we feel we know about this field, where, to be honest with you, many questions are still open and few answers have been unambiguously provided. That sound good? Okay, so I will start with a brief history of the economics of privacy. As I was mentioning, the field is not new. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a number of Chicago School scholars, and Chicago School scholars, I'm referring both to the physical University of Chicago in Illinois, but also to the headquarters, so laissez-faire economics, neoclassical economics, started working in this area. And then there was a silence after this early growth in the field. For about 10 years or more, there was not much happening in terms of economics and privacy. Then in the mid-1990s, a number of economists with a keen interest in information technology, people like Halverian, Eli Noam, Kenneth Loudon, started working again in this field. Most likely because in the mid-1990s we started experiencing the effect of the IT revolution, and then of course with the birth of the internet and the commercial explosion of the internet, there was a revival and in fact a dramatic growth in this field, which is the further stream I indicate in this slide, 2000 and onward. So let me start with the early days. So Chicago School scholars like Posner and Stigler. Posner, I would say it's not a stretch to say Posner had a somewhat negative view on privacy. Posner, who was both an economist and a law scholar working in Chicago, saw privacy fundamentally as concealment of information, not just that, but concealment of negative information. The notion being that, according to Posner, if an individual has a kind of negative trait, for instance, is a low-quality employee, has a low credit score, and so forth, he or she would have an interest in protecting the information, in hiding it. Whereas if he or she had a positive trait, he or she would have an interest in showing it. And if we have regulation which protects data, that inevitably will protect negative information, which means that this information available to buyers in the market. So to the counterparts or a possible transaction with this data subject will actually reduce economic efficiency. In other words, the cost of privacy will be borne by others. And Posner made even an example, pretty bold and pretty bold example by saying, well, if privacy of sex offenders is protected, for instance, after a sex offender has been in jail and he is admitted back into the community, but a record of his past sexual crimes is expunged and removed or hidden, well, the community where the sex offender is going to live will bear the potential cost of this person acting again on his criminal tendencies. And therefore, the privacy of the sex offender imposes an externality, a cost on others. And in typical Chicago School fashion, Posner extended this argument also to marriage, such as before marriage, people try to hide their negative traits and highlight the positive ones. After marriage, all pretenses are over and the truth come out, but by then it's too late, and maybe a poor match between husband and wife has occurred. Bottom line, privacy is redistributive and reduces economic efficiency. So a pretty dismal negative view of privacy, which was echoed in the words in the papers by Stigler and another superstar Chicago School economists, who pointed out that, well, exchanges of information will lead to desirable economic outcomes independently of ownership of the data. Basically, I suppose that many of you in the audience may be familiar with the so-called Coase theorem. Ronald Coase was also himself at the University of Chicago, and Stigler kind of took this idea and brought it into the discussion of privacy by saying, well, if I'm a good debtor, I want this information to be known. If I'm a bad debtor, I want to keep it secret. But if I'm a good debtor and then I hide information, then I will pay IRAs. In practice, no information is the equivalent of bad information. So the absence of information can be interpreted by the counterparts as evidence of bad information. Therefore, even if you protect privacy, at the end of the day, if you have negative information, that will transpire, that will be inferable by others. Also, Stigler pointed out, and this is part of a debate that we still have nowadays over 30 years later, pointed out that actually data, information about the person, even personal information about the person, is not actually the ownership of the person. As we in Europe may tend to construe personal data as a fundamental right of the individual and something which belongs to the individual. Stigler instead said, well, information doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to be, you need to create an infrastructure to collect it. For instance, American Express offering you a credit card, but also building databases, computer servers to collect your purchase data, store it, analyze it. And this cost implies that the data holder is actually the one who rightly owns the data. It's not the data subject. Now, as I was mentioning, after this initial spur of activity in the field of privacy and economics, there was apparently not much interest any longer for over 10 years. And then in the mid-1990s, the economists I was referring to, people like Halverian, Noam, etc., started working again in this field. And Halverian, who was at the time at the University of Michigan, some of you may know him because he has written two of the most popular textbooks in microeconomics. And by the way, then he moved to Berkeley in 1997 to be the dean of the Information School at Berkeley. For full disclosure, he was my advisor there. And then after Berkeley, moved to be the chief economist at Google. So there is a common pattern, a red line of economics of information connecting his work over the years. Well, Varian, in a famous paper in 1996, posited that there are externalities, both positive and negative, which arise due to the secondary use of information. Basically, his point is that a data subject may willingly and knowingly and even rationally engage in a data transaction with another party. For instance, I to Google by doing searches, and I do so willfully and knowingly, and I will get some benefit from Google, such as the search results. The problems arise due to secondary users of information. That Google may use this information in manners which are not predictable by me, and this may cause to me both positive externalities and negative externalities. For instance, Google may share the data with another entity, and this entity may then use the information to price discriminate me, as in the case potentially targeted advertising. He also points out something quite interesting. He frames the modern privacy problems that we face on the internet in a very economic fashion. He points out that there used to be information which was already public or at least semi-public before. For instance, in Pittsburgh, you could go to City Hall and you could find information about how much your colleagues at Mellon University paid for their house, for their home. However, you had to physically go to City Hall, and you had to spend time talking with the clerk and asking for this information. And this cost, which was not insignificant, made it so that few people would actually use or collect that information. So, although the information was technically available, it was in fact semi-private. Some degree of privacy was protected because of the cost of acquiring information. However, because the internet is truly decreasing, sometimes dramatically so, the cost of both acquiring and storing the information, well, this is what creates the new privacy problem nowadays. How do we solve it? Back in the 1990s, Varian was proposing a solution based on, let's define property rights in private information in ways that allow consumers to take control over how information about them is used, and therefore let's make it costly to other parties to access certain information, which is the notion of basically creating markets for privacy and making people pay for consumer data, which we will find recurrently in the past 25, 30 years in economics of privacy. And Noam, pretty much at the same time, in fact, in the same book in which the chapter by Varian that Judge mentioned was published, pointed out he went even more hardcore cause theorem than Stigler had done a few years ago. And Noam pointed out, and this is pretty much straight up cause theorem. In absence of transaction costs in credit data, initial assignment of privacy rights is arbitrary from the viewpoint of economic efficiency. And basically what Noam is saying is the following. Look, it doesn't matter whether there is a initial assignment which gives a right of privacy to individuals, or in fact gives a right to corporations or firms to collect data. What really matters is actually the economic valuations that the different stakeholders give to either the protection of their data or the collection of other people's data, because this is what eventually will drive the economic outcome, and this is what actually will drive who keeps the data and who protects the data. In other words, even if there is a law which gives me the right to protect my data, If Amazon really wants my data, they may offer me money, and I would be willingly giving them the data, even if it's protected, because they're paying me enough money. Vice versa, even if there was a law which allows Amazon to collect any data about me and do anything they want with it, if I really care for privacy, then I will go to Amazon and I will tell Amazon, look, here is X dollars, please keep my data protected. So Illinois is suggesting that what really matters from the point of view of whether privacy will be protected or not is not it is not the summit of rights, it's actually the evaluation of the different subjects. Now, of course, Illinois realizes that this is a little idealistic argument in that, as well known within the framework of discussion related to Cole's theorem, there are many things which can go wrong in the reasoning I just pointed out, such as there could be huge transaction costs, there could be disparities between individuals' ability to negotiate with other parties, there could be problems of asymmetric information, people not even realizing how much other parties know about them, etc., etc., etc. But if you remove all these obstacles, which in real life are pretty powerful, Illinois would conclude that the system of encryption is not determining whether privacy will be protected or not, it will determine actually who pays who. Such as if you have good encryption then, and the default is protection, then it will be the data holders who pay the subjects to basically defy encryption and get the data, or vice versa. If we don't have good encryption, it will be the consumers who will have to pay the data holders in order to stop them from collecting data. And finally, to conclude the little overview of the mid-1990s literature, Kenneth Loudon was the first to organically and explicitly refer to markets for privacy, which were somehow implicit in Halverian's argument, which I covered just 2 slides back, but they were not really fully fleshed out. Instead, Kenneth Loudon at NYU, in 1996, in the complications of the ACM, was the first, to my knowledge, to explicitly say, look, we needed markets for privacy. The idea is to create data warehouses where consumers would put their information, and then if companies want to get this information, they would have to basically pay some kind of micro-payment to the subject in order to get the right of using this information. It's interesting to me being in the program committee often of conferences and workshops at the overlap of economics of privacy. It's interesting to see how many people keep going back to this idea without even knowing that this idea already existed in 1996. So every few years I see a new paper reinventing the markets for privacy without realizing that Kenneth Loudon had already talked about them in 1996. And he had already mentioned some of the obstacles towards those markets. In fact, I believe that those markets don't really exist nowadays, not at least in the version Loudon had envisioned them. Of course, our data, there are markets for our data, obviously, and they are very active. Our data is constantly traded in the business-to-business market. We don't have anything really comparable yet in terms of consumer ability to buy or sell rights over their data, and there are good reasons. There are very clear problems, which, if you like, I can expand over in the Q&A if you have time later. Continuing on this overview, remember, I identified 3 waves of research in economics of privacy. Chicago School, late 70s, early 80s, mid-1990s, and then 2000 onwards. What happened from the 2000 onwards? Well, the internet. The internet really became an incredible commercial and societal force, and this led to an explosion in the interest among economists as well as computer scientists, marketing people, IS people, etc., in studying issues that overlap of economics and information. This led also to a fragmentation of the field into many different fields. We started having finally formal economic models. Up until then, it was mainly position pieces which were using economic thinking, but were not really using economic. They were not really using mathematics or theorems or proving theorem proofs. We started having digital analysis, And we started also adding work on the combined economics and behavior research, trying to understand consumer evaluations of data. Now, when I talk about fragmentation, I want to give you an example with this chart, which initially we prepared for GEL, so the economic literature, our review piece, which you can find on SSRN, by the way. It's pretty long, about 60 pages, but hopefully it's not too boring. And then eventually we didn't use it. We didn't use this because one of the reviewers hated this picture. So I use it in the slides instead because I do feel that it tells a valuable story of fragmentation. How we started adding not just a unified economics of privacy, but sub-fields such as privacy and e-commerce, privacy and discrimination, health economics, credit markets, markets for personal data, spam and identity theft, consumer attitude and behaviors, and all of them, we connect them under the vast umbrella of economics of privacy. However, each of them has its own unique problem, its unique models, which is why I tend to believe that a unified economic theory of privacy does not yet exist. And you know what, probably, or at least possibly, may never, in fact, exist. And this concludes the first part, the brief history of the economics of privacy, which leads me to some of the, what I find the more interesting open issues in this field. For instance, what are actually the costs of privacy intrusions? To what extent there are intangible psychological harms, to what extent there are tangible, economically measurable costs. What is the optimal amount of privacy protection and for which stakeholder? Is an optimal amount of protection for the individual also optimal for society? And if we find this optimal amount, then who provides the optimal amount? How do we make sure that the market that we achieve in the market that particular level? Do we rely on individuals themselves being responsible, knowing their privacy preferences, being fully informed, and making market choices that lead them to this optimal of protection, whatever optimal means? Do we be in the market, in competition, being able to provide end users with that optimal map? Because, hey, no one forces you to be on Facebook, no one forces you to use Google, and if you are a privacy-caring person, you can decide not to use certain services, and you achieve your optimal amount of privacy. Or do we, in fact, need regulation and governmental interventions in order to nudge market toward this optimal privacy, whatever this optimal may mean, and for whatever stakeholder we may refer the adjective optimal to? Are there market failures in the field of privacy? It's a very contentious topic, the topic of market failure, because market failure is, for economists, as ambiguous a term as privacy is for privacy scholars. And what I mean is that privacy scholars have a huge array of definitions for privacy, and market failure similarly have many different definitions depending on who you talk with. You can go from just technically, the definition I really prefer arises from the field of asymmetric information and adverse selection, situations where, because of adverse selection, imagine a market for lemon, eventually a market such as the credit market collapses on itself, and even if there is a demand for, say, insurance, that demand cannot be satisfied. Some other people instead use it much more broadly to refer to any market outcome which is not particularly desirable to them. And in the case of privacy, you can see market failure as well, we don't have enough privacy, or you can see market failure as well, there is no way for people who want privacy to be able to find it. And I'm not taking sides here, I'm just presenting the way, the different ways people refer to, use this term, and a sub item under this issue of market failure is, do reviewer preferences capture actual privacy preferences? Or do they capture actual privacy harm? What do I mean by reveal preferences? I assume that in the audience there is a nice mix of, I presume, computer scientists, economists, mathematicians. So it may not be obvious to everyone, certainly will be obvious to the economists in the room, but not to everyone what reveal preferences are. So economists tend to not to focus on what people say, they tend to focus on what people do. That's why economists don't really pay too much attention to privacy surveys, to what people answer when they're asked how important privacy is for you, because in surveys people can say all sorts of things which do not reflect their actual real underlying preferences and future behavior. So economists look at reveal preferences. So what market behavior reveals about people's preferences. Now, a crucial debate in privacy is whether reveal preferences are actually a good proxy for true underlying preference of people for privacy, such as the fact that people use, many people use Facebook, and many people feel comfortable using Facebook. Is this a proof that people have actually no real interest and value for privacy? Or is it perhaps symptomatic of something different? Some kind of privacy calculus, some mental calculus of privacy costs and privacy benefits of being on Facebook, mixed with some degree of information asymmetry, not really knowing how Facebook will use your data, mixed to some degree of behavioral and cognitive biases, for instance, hyperbolic discounting, etc., etc., etc. So, in other words, there may be a reason why neither stated preferences in surveys, but also not even reveal preferences in the marketplace may actually precisely capture what people's real, quote-unquote, real preference for privacy are. And then even more issues. What I'm going to do here in discussing even more issues is to present a number of arguments that I often see in the current debate, especially here in the United States. I'm not so sure in Europe, but I would guess so, based on what I see at conferences. So I will present a number of comments or positions or claims that people seem to be doing, and I will try to, in a way, critique them, not in the sense of criticize them, but investigate them or analyze them under the light of modern economic thinking. And these claims are, first, privacy concerns are puzzling for economists, in the sense that, hey, real economists are puzzled when people talk about privacy because it doesn't seem that they show what the harm is when Facebook or Google get your data. In fact, you get benefits, targeted ads, services, free services, etc. Second claim, personal information is the lifeblood of the internet, so we need to give away data in order to get all the cool, free services and content we are nowadays used to. Third claim, sharing personal data is an economic win-win. Everyone wins from sharing data. For instance, in targeted advertising. Targeted advertising creates economic win-wins because merchants can focus their advertising budget only on certain consumers who are more likely to buy. Consumers win because they get ads which are more relevant to their preferences. Publishers win because they can sell advertising on their websites, which is more valuable, therefore get more revenues. And of course, the data industry wins because they are the intermediaries between publishers and merchants and consumers. And finally, the last claim is, look, loss of privacy is the price to pay for the benefits of big data. If we want big data, if we want the power to unlock the power of analytics, we have to say goodbye to privacy. Now these are common claims, maybe stretching them out into slight straw man, but if you allow me to do so, this will allow me at least to try to build to prepare economic arguments, to try to see to what extent the straw man is correct. Maybe it has some element of truth, maybe a lot, maybe little. Let's see together. Let's start from the privacy being privacy concerning hazard for economists. Again, the notion that when people say privacy is important, and then you ask them why, they face a good objective reason, something that economists may believe in, by resort to psychological arguments such as, I don't like that Facebook knows this, I feel uncomfortable when Google does that, etc., etc. Now, this is the easiest argument to debunk, because Joe Farrell was the FTC, at the time when he wrote this piece, was the chief economist at the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. And by the way, he's also a very well-known industrial organization economist at Berkeley. He talked about privacy as an intermediate good and as a final good. So a final good is a good that you basically value in and of itself, like a nice dinner. An intermediate good may value as an instrument, as a means to an end, or something else, such as you get insurance. You buy insurance, and it's not like insurance is in and of itself what you are consuming, is the way to decrease the cost down the line is something like that. Now, he points out that privacy as an economic good is both an intermediate good and a final good, depending on the situation. It is an intermediate good when you're using privacy for to protect yourself from identity theft, from discrimination, blackmailing, etc. It is a final good when you're basically caring about privacy in and of itself. It's not like you want to protect your data because you want to avoid price discrimination down the line, but it's you just feel comfortable with certain entities having certain information about you. Now, privacy as a final good is extremely important. It belongs to all the discussion about privacy as autonomy, privacy as freedom, privacy as human dignity. And those are absolutely crucial things, but you know what, they are not the things that typically economists focus on. So if you just focus instead on intermediate, so on the predominantly economic dimensions of privacy, well, even there, we can see how privacy can be important both from a microeconomic perspective as well as from a macroeconomic perspective. So both in terms of welfare allocation, the micro angle, how privacy can affect surplus allocation between different parties, as well as from the macro angle in terms of how the economy grows with and without privacy. And starting from the first argument, the welfare allocation, Posner Stigler, unsurprisingly, pointed out that privacy is redistributed. Remember where I started my talk, I used the example of the sex offender by the Posner was using, and for the employee being a poor employee or a good employee, and when we protect the privacy of the employee, that cost is borne by the employer, and that's why privacy Stigler would say privacy creates redistribution wealth, and that's bad. But in fact, interestingly, also the lack of privacy. And an example is provided by a person who is certainly not suspect of being a pro-privacy economist, because he is, again, Alvaro, who, like I said, is now the chief economist at Google. In the same 1996 paper, which I was mentioning about 10 slides back, the one where he talked about externality, Alvaro made another very simple and yet extremely powerful argument. He said, look, consumers rationally want, by the way, 1996, Howard was talking about telemarketing, okay? That was the problem of the day. People calling you at dinner time, offering you some good over the phone. That was the problem at the time, although you can translate it to the problem nowadays being targeted advertising. Alvaro says, look, consumers rationally want to protect some data, but also share some data. And that's extremely economically rational. For instance, the consumers want to share data with telemarketers regarding what products they are interested in, because that way they are going to get offers which are more relevant to their preferences, rather than the telemarketer wasting their time with offers which are of zero interest to the consumer. However, the consumer also does not want the telemarketer to know how much he or she is interested in those offers, because if the marketer knows exactly how much the person is interested, then the marketer can predict the so-called reservation price, meaning the maximum willingness to pay, and therefore can charge exactly the amount of money for the offer, and therefore extract of economic surplus away from the transaction, away from the consumer. In other words, Halverian put out already over 20 years, about 20 years ago, the strongest economic argument for privacy. Because privacy is not about blocking competing information. It's about managing information flows. And Alberian already 20 years ago was saying, look, it's absolutely economic rational for consumers to manage the information flow so that certain information is revealed to other parties and others is protected. And by the way, we keep finding this result over and over in models that Hyman have worked on, Capitalist Taylor, that worked on, etc., etc., etc. So there is an obvious and rational economic argument for privacy as a private good. I could get into a distinction between first degree, second, third degree. I'll skip it because I can go back to this in the Q&A. I don't want to just spend too much time on this part of my talk. What about the aggregate welfare effect on privacy? So I just said that from a macro perspective, from the perspective of each individual, it's obvious the privacy is rational, economically rational. But what about from the aggregate perspective? So if everyone focuses on their own narrow desire for privacy, and for instance, if folks are reducing information they reveal to others in aggregate place, isn't that bad from an aggregate standpoint? Because now society is not able to unlock the societal value of information. The big data argument that the more people reveal, the more medical researchers can collect about the medical information of many millions patients, the better equipped we are to, I don't know, find the cure for some disease, find patterns in the data which expose either some problem or some solution to the problem. So what about the argument? Well, as often in the field of economics, the answer is it depends. Because you can find theoretical papers in economics showing that privacy, again, bad from the standpoint of aggregate economic welfare. Again, the Stigler-Faulkner argument of economic inefficiency is created from data protection. But you can also find the opposite argument, such as in absence of regulation which protects data, market players will face an excessive incentive to collect information. Basically, they will overinvest. They will invest more than socially optimal, and this will create a divergence between the private value and the social value of information. So we will actually overinvest and collect more information than we actually need for a social optimum. So, to summarize, privacy concerns puzzling for economists? Well, not necessarily. Let's counter it with a question. When is privacy welfare is enhancing? When privacy is welfare enhancing? When is privacy welfare decreasing? Second conventional wisdom, the economic win-win of sharing data, which is used often by the industry to sell consumers the benefits of targeted advertising. Here, let me show you two semi-recent work we have done to show how, in reality, data trades can create winners and losers. And sometimes these winners and losers are across data subjects. So some data subjects win for sharing, some lose for sharing, and some are between data subjects and data holders. The first example, this is an experiment that we ran a couple years ago at CMU, in which we wanted to see whether employers in the US have started using Facebook and social media in general to find information about job candidates, and whether in fact they find they use information which is personal and protected under US legislation, such as sexual orientation of a candidate or religious affiliation of a candidate or a job candidate, which an employer in the US is not allowed to ask about or use in the process of interviewing and hiring people. But you know what? They don't need to ask about that any longer because many people may provide that information freely available on their Facebook profile. So what we did was to create resumes for fictional job candidates and send them out to over 4,000 employers in the United States, applying openings that these employers had. Now, the resumes were very professional and didn't have any link or reference to personal information of the candidates, no reference to sexuality, religion, family status, etc. However, if the employer who had received our job application decided to search on Google or on Bing or Yahoo search the name of the candidate, the employer would be bound to find the LinkedIn profiles, which we also had created for these fictional candidates, as well as the Facebook profiles, which were created for these candidates. Now, the LinkedIn profiles also contain only professional information consistent with the information in the CV. However, in the Facebook profiles, we have added personal information such as sexual orientation or religious affiliation, which could not be otherwise available from LinkedIn or from the resume. And what we were interested in was to capture the so-called callback rate, basically whether the probability that a resume with an individual with a certain background would be invited for an interview by the employer. And what we did was to experimentally manipulate, as I said, sexual orientation. So we had a gay candidate and a straight candidate, and also a religious affiliation. So we had a Muslim candidate and a Christian candidate. And then we randomly assigned these thousands of employers to these four experimental conditions. What we found was that in terms of callback rates, there was absolutely no difference whatsoever for the gay candidate versus the straight candidate. Both had a 10.2% probability of being called for an interview. However, when it gets to Muslim versus Christian, we do find a difference. At the national level, all across the United States, this difference is not very significant. 12% callback rate for Christian, about 10 something for Muslim. But when we dig deeper in the data and we split the results by state, as you know, in the United States, there is huge diversity in terms of democratic leaning, more conservative and mixed. What we find is that in the more conservative states, the Christian candidate is 6 times more likely to be invited for interviews than the Muslim candidate. So yes, there is a huge economic effect of revealing information, personal information in your Facebook profile in the open, because employers, at least in certain states, at least certain employers do pay attention to it. Second example, and this is instead a ongoing work which we presented at the Federal Trade Commission Privacy Conference early this year, but it's still not published. This is about the field of so-called real-time bidding, RTB. What is real-time bidding? Well, imagine there is a publisher, so a website, advertisers, companies that want to show you ads in an ad exchange. It could be Google, it could be Facebook. The publisher, for instance, could be CNN. And the advertisers who want to show you ads could be Nike and Balance. Now, when a consumer arrives on CNN website, CNN passes the information from the cookie to the ad exchange. The ad exchange may recognize this consumer, infer things such as, oh, this is probably male, probably between 20 and 25, probably interested in sneakers. And then passes the information to potential advertisers, and these advertisers have to decide whether and how much to bid, show an ad to these particular consumers. They send it to the ad exchange. The ad exchange runs the auction and finds the winning bid, and then shows the winning ad to the consumer. And this happens in milliseconds. Okay, so this is what happens online when you go on very common websites without you even realizing this. Now, most economic work on real-time bidding is focused on simple two-players models, typically the consumer and the advertisers, sometimes the intermediary, meaning the ad exchange advertisers. What we wanted to see, however, what happens when you study a three-player model. So when you consider the three players at the same time, consumer, ad exchange, and merchants, we cannot include yet publishers. There will be a four-player model. It's one order of magnitude more complex to solve using game theory, but hopefully we will work on that. But right now, we already implement this literature by studying what happens when there are three players, and specifically what happens to surplus allocation. So we wanted to see if targeted ads increase economic surplus. Where does the surplus go as function of how much information is being collected by consumers. So we start with the case, and these are just very summary, very rough results. I could, in the Q&A, I could spend more time discussing these results at length. But we start from the case of no information, where the ad exchange doesn't know anything about the consumer, and therefore the merchants have to bid without really knowing who this consumer is. And you have this allocation of surplus between consumer and intermediaries. And the firm doesn't make much because it doesn't have any information about the consumers. And then we have the case of horizontal information, meaning brand preferences, whether this particular consumer on the CNN website prefers night or values. And here you see that the surplus allocation changes, is different. And then there is the case of vertical information. By vertical information, we refer to basically whether a consumer is a high-income consumer, low-income consumer, so whether he or she can pay more or less for products in general. And now you see again a different allocation of surplus. And finally, the case of complete information, when the ad exchange knows exactly what the consumer's brand preferences are, and also knows how much he or she is willing to pay. And now you can see the consumer surplus goes to zero. Why? Because the consumer gets perfectly price discrimination, first-degree price discrimination. So the point here is to observe that as function of how much information is being collected and used by stakeholders in the advertising ecosystem, the surplus for consumers will change dramatically. So in answer to sharing personal data is an economic win-win, well, the counterpoint is a question. When do consumers benefit and when do they not benefit from trades in personal data? Now, I realize that I have about 12 minutes left, and I would like to ask for advice on whether you would like me to keep talking for a little bit or stop here and start getting questions.
So, are there any urgent questions? So maybe we'll leave them. Maybe we'll leave them to the end. So let's maybe another 7 minutes, and we'll have 5 minutes for questions.
Wonderful, thank you. So the other phrase, the other conventional wisdom points I want to get are personal information is the lifeblood of the internet, and then the other comment related to basically privacy. We have to give away privacy to get the benefits of the data. So personal information is the lifeblood of the internet. The argument that you find often is, look, we would not be able to have all the cool services we enjoy now. Free news on New York Times, free profiles on Facebook, searches, etc., unless we give away all these things. And this is a little puzzling to me from an economic standpoint, for the following reason. And I will play a little experiment with you. Experiment is, ask yourself these questions. Could you get a free email account back in 2000? Yes. You get a free social networking profile in 2002. Yes, again. Facebook was started in 2004, but in 2002 we already had MySpace, Friendster, Orkut. Could you use search engines for free in 2002? Of course. Could you post classifieds free in 2002? Absolutely. Regulars and many others. Could you read online news free in 2002? Absolutely yes. In fact, probably more free news then than now, because now many big players in the US market at least have implemented paywalls, etc., etc., etc. So what I'm trying to point attention towards here is that actually we already had lots of free services, free content back in a time when information was being collected, but not to the degree it's being collected now. Because before Facebook entered the game, data collection was not as ubiquitous, identified as now, and definitely not, there was not cross-matching of data between different websites and different services as we have now. So clearly, it is true that we have more content now, or it seems clear to me that we have more free content now, and also there has been an improvement in the services. For instance, Google Maps keeps getting better and better. So that is undeniable. However, from an economic standpoint, I'm really interested in being able to compare the marginal cost of privacy. So how much more improved data collection techniques have become in the last basically 10 years or so, from basically 2004, 2005 till now, versus the marginal benefits, how much more consumers are getting from this data extraction. So I'm making a marginal economic argument rather than an aggregate economic argument. Another way to frame this is to what extent is the increase, both in quality and quantity, in the collection of consumer data in the last 10 years causally linked or causally linkable to the increasing provision of more and better free services and content. So do we actually, can we actually causally link more free content and better services to increasing identifiability of data, increasing linkability of data across services? We really don't know. Another way of phrasing the question is, if extra surplus because it's generated by more sophisticated and more far-reaching, also more intrusive consumer tracking techniques. Who is getting the surplus? To what extent the surplus is going back to consumers in terms of better services? To what extent it's going to merchants to advertise? To what extent it's actually increasing the profits of the intermediaries, the Google and the Facebook of the world? And the answer is, we really don't know. Honestly, I tried to find any paper who could find a causal link and say, this is how much consumers benefit, this is how much the data industries benefit. There is no such work. And this, to me, is one of the crucial questions that we in the field of economics of privacy face, because we really want to know whether the industry claim that everyone wins and you have to give away data to get these free services, your data is the lifeblood, to what extent those claims are actually true. And which relates to the other point, is a very closely related point. People make that loss of privacy is the price to pay for the benefits of the data. Well, if you look at the economic literature, we find that once again the it depends answer. Because we find the studies which suggest that indeed privacy regulation reduces technological adoption innovation. In other words, when we protect privacy, we have less innovation, less analytics, or at least less benefits from analytics, etc., etc., etc. But you know what? We find also the opposite type of results. In a paper we just got out in, well, just a few months ago, we got out in Manager Science, we found that in the American states with stronger privacy regulation, there was a higher probability of growth and success of HIE, which stands for Health Information Exchanges, which are networks of health-related organizations created to share electronic medical records. And it seems to be the case that when there is this regulation, entrepreneurs in those states feel more clear about what can be done with consumer data, patients' data, and what cannot, and this unlocks their entrepreneurial potential. The key seems to be what type of regulation. So poor regulation can reduce, poor privacy regulation can reduce technology adoption, good regulation can actually increase it. Furthermore, there is so much research from many industry labs and departments, research academic departments around the world, including, of course, and most prominently so in Cambridge, on privacy-enhancing technologies. We can browse anonymously. We can use browsers that are more privacy-enhanced than the ones that are more popular among consumers. We can send emails which are protected. We can search in a privacy-protected manner. If you name any site that we do electronically nowadays, you can find a more privacy-enhanced counterpart that some smart computer scientists somewhere in the world has developed. And these technologies don't stop entirely the flow of data, but allow for data to be shared while data is also simultaneously being protected. And to me, the interesting question, so to offer a counterpoint to the conventional wisdom that, hey, we have to give away privacy to get the benefits of the data, to me the interesting question is an economic question, which is, look, we actually have technologies which can protect data while allowing still analytics to work. Now, clearly, this data, these technologies, do decrease the quality or granularity or specificity of the data, obviously so. So there is no free lunch, to use economic terms. But the interesting economic question is, if we do acknowledge that these technologies create a cost, who is going to bear the cost? So if we start employing and deploying not just privacy by design, but privacy by default. All computers come with PGP incorporated, Tor incorporated, DuckDuckGo is the default browser, search engine, etc., etc., etc. What cost will there be to society, and specifically within the society, who will bear them? It will be consumers who get ads which are less targeted. It will be the data industry, which will see a reduction in profits because they can use and leverage lower quality data. Or it will be the society as a whole, because by using privacy-enhancing technologies, we are decreasing the societal value of data, and we make it harder for scientists to rely on analytics to discover new cure for cancers, the cure for cancer, discover other new important things. We really don't know. We don't know the answer to this question, and this is again another important question to ask in the field. So to summarize, what I did was to present on the left column some conventional wisdom you find in the privacy debate, in the economic privacy debate nowadays, and to counter them with what I think are open research questions. And just to conclude, I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, I don't see any unified economic theory of privacy on the horizon. The field is so dispersed, and that's okay, it's not a problem. At the microeconomic level, there is an obvious economic rationale for privacy. At the macroeconomic level, things are a little more complicated and nuanced. It depends on context. Facts may allow us to have the cake and eat it too. But remember, I intentionally ignore two very important dimensions. One, the non-economic dimension of privacy. Privacy is freedom and autonomy, etc. I ignored it, not because they are not important, but because I wanted to build my argument purely from inside traditional economic theory. And secondly, I completely ignored pretty much 85% of my research, which is about behavioral economics. So about the challenges the consumers face when they face privacy trade-off. And this is perhaps argument for another talk or another story. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
So, Prof, for a couple of questions. Yes, please. Maybe. So probably, if you speak a little bit louder.
And what is your views on the privacy regulation and competition on the market?
The question is, you heard the question.
No, I can hear you better probably because you are closer. Could you be so kind to repeat the question for me, please?
I think you need to come here or speak up a little bit.
So, what is your view on the relation between privacy protection and competition on the market?
So it's privacy protection versus competition in the market. So the question is about your views on that.
I apologize. I got one part, which is you are drawing you are talking about privacy protection versus efficiency.
No. Competition. So I mentioned between interplay between privacy policy and policy regarding competition on the market, regulating competition on the market.
Sorry, one more time. I apologize. The audio is really poor. I'm really sorry.
So this is a question about policy regarding privacy and policy regarding competition on the market.
Competition.
Privacy and what in the market?
Competition.
Competition. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Competition. Yes. Thank you, and I apologize. The key word was competition. So I assume you're referring to the very interesting debate on whether privacy protection will be competition enhancing or in fact competition decreasing. Is that your angle?
Yes, yeah.
So it's I will disappoint you in that. My short answer is I don't know. I've seen good papers claiming both sides of this argument, right? That when you have a stronger regulation, you're actually helping the incumbent, which is the economic term to refer to the firm which is already in the marketplace, at the cost of the potential entrant. So you make it more difficult for entrants to enter a new market because they will not be able to get the data that Google has already accumulated. And therefore, this will decrease competition. So I see the argument that privacy regulation will penalize competition because it makes it more difficult for entrants to put pressure on incumbents. I also see the opposite argument, that if we actually make it run in the proper way, we can create actually more competition by having a better privacy regulation. And I side a little bit more on this last side of the argument, the second one, but I've not done myself explicit research on this to be able to provide a robust answer. What I will point out, however, is that there has been a very interesting work by a number of scholars. One of them, for instance, Alex Penplan of Sandy Penplan at MIT, who is a computer scientist who understands economics. He has been working, remember I was referring to Kenneth Loudon, the idea of creating markets for privacy. Sally Pentland is one of the people who actually, in my book, has come closer to describing an infrastructure, technology and economic infrastructure, which could actually finally implement the current markets. And under that infrastructure, basically everyone would have the same access to data, in that the data would be identified, there would be different tools from differential privacy to maybe homomorphic encryption and other ways to protect individual data, therefore individual privacy, while still allowing the societal value of data to be unlocked. Under that approach, then privacy protection would indeed be good for competition rather than being poor for competition. But like I said, there are two sides of this argument, and although I have a slight preference towards one side, I cannot say strongly that I believe strongly one or the other.
Okay, maybe one more question. Okay, thank you very much. We have to proceed with our next talk, but thanks. I appreciate your involvement.